This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16. Shipwrecked Mariners. Ample proof of Rob's careless and restless nature having been frankly placed before the reader in these pages, you will doubtless be surprised when I relate that during the next few hours our young gentleman suffered from a serious attack of homesickness, becoming as gloomy and unhappy in its duration as ever a homesick boy could be. It may have been because he was just then cut off from all his fellow creatures, and even from the world itself. It may have been because he was satiated with marvels and with the almost absolute control over the powers which the Demon had conferred upon him. Or it may have been because he was born and reared a hearty, healthy American boy, with a disposition to battle openly with the world and take his chances equally with his fellows, rather than be placed in such an exclusive position that no one could hope successfully to oppose him. Perhaps he himself did not know what gave him this horrible attack of the blues, but the truth is he took out his handkerchief and cried like a baby from very loneliness and misery. There was no one to see him, thank goodness, and the tears gave him considerable relief. He dried his eyes, made an honest struggle to regain his cheerfulness, and then muttered to himself, "If I stay up here like an air bubble in the sky, I shall certainly go crazy. I suppose there's nothing but water to look at down below, but if I could only sight a ship or even see a fish jump, it would do me no end of good." Thereupon he descended until, as the ocean's surface came nearer and nearer, he discovered a tiny island lying almost directly underneath him. It was hardly big enough to make a dot on the biggest map, but a clump of trees grew in the central portion, while around the edges were jagged rocks protecting a sandy beach and a stretch of flower-strewn upland leading to the trees. It looked very beautiful from Rob's elevated position, and his spirits brightened at once. "I'll drop down and pick a bouquet!" he exclaimed, and a few minutes later his feet touched the firm earth of the island. But before he could gather a dozen of the brilliant flowers, a glad shout reached his ears, and looking up he saw two men running towards him from the trees. They were dressed in sailor fashion, but their clothing was reduced to rags, and scarcely clung to their brown, skinny bodies. As they advanced, they waved their arms wildly in the air and cried in joyful tones, "A boat! A boat!" Rob stared at them wonderingly and had much ado to prevent the poor fellows from hugging him outright, so great was their joy at his appearance. One of them rolled upon the ground, laughing and crying by turns, while the other danced and cut capers until he became so exhausted that he sank down breathless beside his comrade. "How came you here, then?" inquired the boy, in pitying tones. "We're shipwrecked American sailors from the bark 'Cynthia Jane,' which went down near here over a month ago," answered the smallest and thinnest of the two. "We escaped by clinging to a bit of wreckage and floated to this island, where we have nearly starved to death. Indeed, we have now eaten everything on the island that was eatable, and had your boat arrived a few days later you'd have found us lying dead upon the beach." Rob listened to this sad tale with real sympathy. "But I didn't come here in a boat," said he. The men sprang to their feet with white, scared faces. "No boat!" they cried. "Are you, too, shipwrecked?" "No," he answered. "I flew here through the air." And then he explained to them the wonderful electric traveling machine. But the sailors had no interest whatever in the relation. Their disappointment was something awful to witness, and one of them laid his head upon his comrade's shoulder and wept with unrestrained grief, so weak and discouraged had they become through suffering. Suddenly Rob remembered that he could assist them, and took the box of concentrated food tablets from his pocket. "Eat these," he said, offering one to each of the sailors. At first they could not understand that these small tablets would be able to allay the pangs of hunger, but when Rob explained their virtues the men ate them greedily. Within a few moments they were so greatly restored to strength and courage that their eyes brightened, their sunken cheeks flushed, and they were able to converse with their benefactor with calmness and intelligence. Then the boy sat beside them upon the grass and told them the story of his acquaintance with the Demon and of all his adventures since he had come into possession of the wonderful electric contrivances. In his present mood he felt it would be a relief to confide in someone, and so these poor lonely men were the first to hear his story. When he related the manner in which he had clung to the Turk while both ascended into the air, the elder of the two sailors listened with rapt attention, and then, after some thought, asked, "Why couldn't you carry one or both of us to America?" Rob took time seriously to consider this idea, while the sailors eyed him with eager interest. Finally he said, "I'm afraid I couldn't support your weight long enough to reach any other land. It's a long journey, and you'd pull my arms out of joint before we'd been up an hour." Their faces fell at this, but one of them said, "Why couldn't we swing ourselves over your shoulders with a rope? Our two bodies would balance each other, and we are so thin and emaciated that we do not weigh very much." While considering this suggestion, Rob remembered how at one time 5 pirates had clung to his left leg and been carried some distance through the air. "Have you a rope?" he asked. "No," was the answer, "but there are plenty of long, tough vines growing on the island that are just as strong and pliable as ropes." "Then, if you are willing to run the chances," decided the boy, "I will make the attempt to save you. But I must warn you that in case I find I cannot support the weight of your bodies, I shall drop one or both of you into the sea." They looked grave at this prospect, but the biggest one said, "We would soon meet death from starvation if you left us here on the island. So as there is at least a chance of our being able to escape in your company, I, for one, am willing to risk being drowned. It is easier and quicker than being starved, and as I'm the heavier, I suppose you'll drop me first." "Certainly," declared Rob promptly. This announcement seemed to be an encouragement to the little sailor, but he said nervously, "I hope you'll keep near the water, for I haven't a good head for heights. They always make me dizzy." "Oh, if you don't want to go," began Rob, "I can easily—" "But I do! I do!" cried the little man, interrupting him. "I shall die if you leave me behind." "Well, then, get your ropes, and we'll do the best we can," said the boy. They ran to the trees, around the trunks of which were clinging many tendrils of greenish-brown vine, which possessed remarkable strength. With their knives they cut a long section of this vine, the ends of which were then tied into loops large enough to permit the sailors to sit in them comfortably. The connecting piece Rob padded with seaweed gathered from the shore, to prevent its cutting into his shoulders. "Now then," he said, when all was ready, "take your places." The sailors squatted in the loops, and Rob swung the vine over his shoulders and turned the indicator of the traveling machine to up. As they slowly mounted into the sky, the little sailor gave a squeal of terror and clung to the boy's arm, but the other, although seemingly anxious, sat quietly in his place and made no trouble. "Don't go so high," stammered the little one, tremblingly. "Suppose we should fall." "Well, suppose we should," answered Rob gruffly. "You couldn't drown until you struck the water, so the higher we are the longer you'll live in case of accident." This phase of the question seemed to comfort the frightened fellow somewhat, but as he said, he had not a good head for heights, and so continued to tremble in spite of his resolve to be brave. The weight on Rob's shoulders was not so great as he had feared, the traveling machine seeming to give a certain lightness and buoyancy to everything that came into contact with its wearer. As soon as he had reached a sufficient elevation to admit of good speed, he turned the indicator once more to the east and began moving rapidly through the air, the shipwrecked sailors dangling at either side. "This is awful!" gasped the little one. "Say, you shut up!" commanded the boy angrily. "If your friend was as big a coward as you are, I'd drop you both this minute. Let go of my arm and keep quiet if you want to reach land alive." The fellow whimpered a little, but managed to remain silent for several minutes. Then he gave a sudden twitch and grabbed Rob's arm again. Suppose the vine should break!" he moaned, a horrified look upon his face. "I've had about enough of this," said Rob, savagely. "If you haven't any sense you don't deserve to live." He turned the indicator on the dial of the machine, and they began to descend rapidly. The little fellow screamed with fear, but Rob paid no attention to him until the feet of the two suspended sailors were actually dipping into the waves, when he brought their progress to an abrupt halt. "What are you going to do?" gurgled the cowardly sailor. "I'm going to feed you to the sharks, unless you promise to keep your mouth shut," retorted the boy. "Now, then, decide at once. Which will it be, sharks or silence?" "I won't say a word. 'Pon my honor, I won't," said the sailor, shudderingly. "All right. Remember your promise, and we'll have no further trouble," remarked Rob, who had hard work to keep from laughing at the man's abject terror. Once more he ascended and continued the journey, and for several hours they rode along swiftly and silently. Rob's shoulders were beginning to ache with the continued tugging of the vine upon them, but the thought that he was saving the lives of two unfortunate fellow creatures gave him strength and courage to persevere. Night was falling when they first sighted land, a wild and seemingly uninhabited stretch of the American coast. Rob made no effort to select a landing place, for he was nearly worn out with the strain and anxiety of the journey. He dropped his burden upon the brow of a high bluff overlooking the sea, and casting the vine from his shoulders, fell to the earth, exhausted and half fainting. End of chapter 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. The Coast of Oregon. When he had somewhat recovered, Rob sat up and looked around him. The elder sailor was kneeling in earnest prayer, offering grateful thanks for his escape from suffering and death. The younger one lay upon the ground, sobbing and still violently agitated by recollections of the frightful experiences he had undergone. Although he did not show his feelings as plainly as the men, the boy was none the less gratified at having been instrumental in saving the lives of two fellow beings. The darkness was by this time rapidly enveloping them, so Rob asked his companions to gather some brushwood and light a fire, which they quickly did. The evening was cool for the time of year, and the heat from the fire was cheering and grateful, so they all lay near the glowing embers and fell fast asleep. The sound of voices aroused Rob next morning, and on opening his eyes and gazing around he saw several rudely dressed men approaching. The two shipwrecked sailors were still sound asleep. Rob stood up and waited for the strangers to draw near. They seemed to be fishermen, and were much surprised at finding three people asleep upon the bluff. "Whar in thunder did ye come from?" asked the foremost fisherman in a surprised voice. "From the sea," replied the boy. "My friends here are shipwrecked sailors from the Cynthia Jane." "But how'd you make out to climb the bluff?" inquired a second fisherman. "No one ever did it afore, as we knows on." "Oh, that is a long story," replied the boy evasively. The two sailors had awakened and now saluted the newcomers. Soon they were exchanging a running fire of questions and answers. "Where are we?" Rob heard the little sailor ask. "Coast of Oregon," was the reply. "We're about 7 miles from Port Orford by land and about 10 miles by sea." "Do you live at Port Orford?" inquired the sailor. "That's what we do, friend. And if your party wants to join us, we'll do our best to make you comfortable, bein' as you're shipwrecked and need help." Just then a loud laugh came from another group, where the elder sailor had been trying to explain Rob's method of flying through the air. "Laugh all you want to," said the sailor sullenly. "It's true, every word of it." "Maybe you think it, friend," answered a big, good-natured fisherman, "but it's well known that shipwrecked folks go crazy sometimes and imagine strange things. Your mind seems clear enough in other ways, so I advise you to try and forget your dreams about flyin'." Rob now stepped forward and shook hands with the sailors. "I see you have found friends," he said to them, "so I will leave you and continue my journey, as I'm in something of a hurry." Both sailors began to thank him profusely for their rescue, but he cut them short. "That's all right. Of course I couldn't leave you on that island to starve to death, and I'm glad I was able to bring you away with me." "But you threatened to drop me into the sea," remarked the little sailor, in a grieved voice. "So I did," said Rob, laughing. "But I wouldn't have done it for the world, not even to have saved my own life. Good bye." He turned the indicator and mounted skyward, to the unbounded amazement of the fishermen, who stared after him with round eyes and wide open mouths. "This sight will prove to them that the sailors are not crazy," he thought, as he turned to the south and sped away from the bluff. "I suppose those simple fishermen will never forget this wonderful occurrence, and they'll probably make regular heroes of the two men who have crossed the Pacific through the air." He followed the coastline, keeping but a short distance above the earth, and after an hour's swift flight reached the city of San Francisco. His shoulders were sore and stiff from the heavy strain upon them of the previous day, and he wished more than once that he had some of his mother's household liniment to rub them with. Yet so great was his delight at reaching once more his native land that all discomforts were speedily forgotten. Much as he would have enjoyed a day in the great metropolis of the Pacific slope, Rob dared not delay longer than to take a general view of the place, to note its handsome edifices, and to wonder at the throng of Chinese inhabiting one section of the town. These things were much more plainly and quickly viewed by Rob from above than by threading a way through the streets on foot, for he looked down upon the city as a bird does, and covered miles with a single glance. Having satisfied his curiosity without attempting to alight, he turned to the southeast and followed the peninsula as far as Palo Alto, where he viewed the magnificent buildings of the university. Changing his course to the east, he soon reached Mount Hamilton, and being attracted by the great tower of the Lick Observatory, he hovered over it until he found he had attracted the excited gaze of its inhabitants, who doubtless observed him very plainly through the big telescope. But so unreal and seemingly impossible was the sight witnessed by the learned astronomers that they have never ventured to make the incident public, although long after the boy had darted away into the east they argued together concerning the marvelous and incomprehensible vision. Afterward they secretly engrossed the circumstance upon their records, but resolved never to mention it in public, lest their wisdom and veracity should be assailed by the skeptical. Meantime, Rob rose to a higher altitude and sped swiftly across the great continent. By noon he sighted Chicago, and after a brief inspection of the place from the air, determined to devote at least an hour to forming the acquaintance of this most wonderful and cosmopolitan city. End of Chapter 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. A Narrow Escape. The auditorium tower, where the weatherman sits to flash his reports throughout the country, offered an inviting place for the boy to alight. He dropped quietly upon the roof of the great building and walked down the staircase until he reached the elevators, by means of which he descended to the ground floor without exciting special attention. The eager rush and hurry of the people crowding the sidewalks impressed Rob with the idea that they were all behind time and were trying hard to catch up. He found it impossible to walk along comfortably without being elbowed and pushed from side to side, so a half-hour's sightseeing under such difficulties tired him greatly. It was a beautiful afternoon, and finding himself upon the lake front, Rob hunted up a vacant bench and sat down to rest. Presently an elderly gentleman with a reserved and dignified appearance and dressed in black took a seat next to the boy and drew a magazine from his pocket. Rob saw that he opened it to an article on the progress of modern science, in which he seemed greatly interested. After a time the boy remembered that he was hungry, not having eaten a tablet in more than 24 hours. So he took out the silver box and ate one of the small round discs it contained. "What are those?" inquired the old gentleman in a soft voice. "You are too young to be taking patent medicines." "These are not medicines, exactly," answered the boy with a smile. "They are concentrated food tablets, stored with nourishment by means of electricity. One of them furnishes a person with food for an entire day." The old gentleman stared at Rob a moment and then laid down his magazine and took the box in his hands, examining the tablets curiously. "Are these patented?" he asked. "No," said Rob. "They are unknown to any one but myself." "I will give you $500,000 for the recipe to make them," said the gentleman. "I fear I must refuse your offer," returned Rob with a laugh. "I'll make it 1,000,000," said the gentleman coolly. Rob shook his head. "Money can't buy the recipe," he said, "for I don't know it myself." "Couldn't the tablets be chemically analyzed and the secret discovered?" inquired the other. "I don't know, but I'm not going to give anyone the chance to try," declared the boy firmly. The old gentleman picked up his magazine without another word and resumed his reading. For amusement Rob took the Record of Events from his pocket and began looking at the scenes reflected from its polished plate. Presently he became aware that the old gentleman was peering over his shoulder with intense interest. General Funston was just then engaged in capturing the rebel chief Aguinaldo, and for a few moments both man and boy observed the occurrence with rapt attention. As the scene was replaced by showing a secret tunnel of the Russian Nihilists, with the conspirators carrying dynamite to a recess underneath the palace of the Czar, the gentleman uttered a long sigh and asked, "Will you sell that box?" "No," answered Rob shortly, and put it back into his pocket. "I'll give you $1,000,000 to control the sale in Chicago alone," continued the gentleman, with an eager inflection in his smooth voice. "You seem quite anxious to get rid of money," remarked Rob carelessly. "How much are you worth?" "Personally?" "Yes." "Nothing at all, young man. I am not offering you my own money. But with such inventions as you have exhibited, I could easily secure millions of capital. Suppose we form a trust and place them upon the market. We'll capitalize it for 100 millions, and you can have a quarter of the stock, 25 millions. That would keep you from worrying about grocery bills." "But I wouldn't need groceries if I had the tablets," said Rob, laughing. "True enough; but you could take life easily and read your newspaper in comfort, without being in any hurry to get downtown to business. 25 millions would bring you a cozy little income if properly invested." "I don't see why one should read newspapers when the Record of Events shows all that is going on in the world," objected Rob. "True, true. But what do you say to the proposition?" "I must decline with thanks. These inventions are not for sale." The gentleman sighed and resumed his magazine, in which he became much absorbed. Rob put on the character marking spectacles and looked at him. The letters E, W, and C were plainly visible upon the composed, respectable-looking brow of his companion. "Evil, wise, and cruel," reflected Rob, as he restored the spectacles to his pocket. "How easily such a man could impose upon people! To look at him, one would think that butter wouldn't melt in his mouth." He decided to part company with this chance acquaintance, and, rising from his seat, strolled leisurely up the walk. A moment later, on looking back, he discovered that the old gentleman had disappeared. He walked down State Street to the river and back again, amused by the activity displayed in this busy section of the city. But the time he had allowed himself in Chicago had now expired, so he began looking around for some high building from the roof of which he could depart unnoticed. This was not at all difficult, and selecting one of the many stores he ascended by an elevator to the top floor, and from there mounted an iron stairway leading to the flat roof. As he climbed this stairway he found himself followed by a pleasant-looking young man, who also seemed desirous of viewing the city from the roof. Annoyed at the inopportune intrusion, Rob's first thought was to go back to the street and try another building, but upon reflecting that the young man was not likely to remain long and he would soon be alone, he decided to wait. So he walked to the edge of the roof and appeared to be interested in the scenery spread out below him. "Fine view from here, ain't it?" said the young man, coming up to him and placing his hand carelessly upon the boy's shoulder. "It is indeed," replied Rob, leaning over the edge to look into the street. As he spoke he felt himself gently but firmly pushed from behind, and, losing his balance, he plunged head foremost from the roof and whirled through the intervening space towards the sidewalk far below. Terrified though he was by the sudden disaster, the boy had still wit enough remaining to reach out his right hand and move the indicator of the machine upon his left wrist to the 0 mark. Immediately he paused in his fearful flight, and presently came to a stop at a distance of less than 15 feet from the flagstones which had threatened to crush out his life. As he stared downward, trying to recover his self-possession, he saw the old gentleman he had met on the lake front, standing just below and looking at him with a half-frightened, half-curious expression in his eyes. At once Rob saw through the whole plot to kill him and thus secure possession of his electrical devices. The young man upon the roof who had attempted to push him to his death was a confederate of the innocent-appearing old gentleman, it seemed, and the latter had calmly awaited his fall to the pavement to seize the coveted treasures from his dead body. It was an awful idea, and Rob was more frightened than he had ever been before in his life, or ever has been since. But now the shouts of a vast concourse of amazed spectators reached the boy's ears. He remembered that he was suspended in mid-air over the crowded street of a great city, while thousands of wondering eyes were fixed upon him. So he quickly set the indicator to the word "up," and mounted skyward until the watchers below could scarcely see him. Then he fled away into the east, even yet shuddering with the horror of his recent escape from death, and filled with disgust at the knowledge that there were people who held human life so lightly that they were willing to destroy it to further their own selfish ends. And the Demon wants such people as these to possess his electrical devices, which are as powerful to accomplish evil when in wrong hands as they are good, thought the boy resentfully. This would be a fine world if electric tubes and records of events and traveling machines could be acquired by selfish and unprincipled persons. So unnerved was Rob by his recent experiences that he determined to make no more stops. However, he alighted at nightfall in the country and slept upon the sweet hay in a farmer's barn. But early the next morning, before anyone else was astir, he resumed his journey, and at precisely 10 o'clock of this day, which was Saturday, he completed his flying trip around the world by alighting unobserved upon the well-trimmed lawn of his own home. End of Chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 19. Rob Makes a Resolution. When Rob opened the front door, he came face to face with Nell, who gave an exclamation of joy and threw herself into his arms. "Oh, Rob!" she cried. "I'm so glad you've come! We have all been dreadfully worried about you, and Mother—" "Well, what about Mother?" inquired the boy anxiously, as she paused. "She's been very ill, Rob, and the doctor said today that unless we heard from you soon he would not be able to save her life. The uncertainty about you is killing her." Rob stood stock still, all the eager joy of his return frozen into horror at the thought that he had caused his dear mother so much suffering. "Where is she, Nell?" he asked brokenly. "In her room. Come, I'll take you to her." Rob followed with beating heart, and soon was clasped close to his mother's breast. "Oh, my boy, my dear boy!" she murmured, and then for very joy and love she was unable to say more, but held him tight and stroked his hair gently and kissed him again and again. Rob said little except to promise that he would never again leave home without her full consent and knowledge. But in his mind he contrasted the love and comfort that now surrounded him with the lonely and unnatural life he had been leading, and boy though he was in years, a mighty resolution that would have been creditable to an experienced man took firm root in his heart. He was obliged to recount all his adventures to his mother, and although he made light of the dangers he had passed through, the story drew many sighs and shudders from her. When luncheon time arrived, he met his father, and Mr. Jocelyn took occasion to reprove his son in strong language for running away from home and leaving them filled with anxiety as to his fate. However, when he saw how happy and improved in health his dear wife was at her boy's return, and when he had listened to Rob's manly confession of error and expressions of repentance, he speedily forgave the culprit and treated him as genially as ever. Of course, the whole story had to be repeated, his sisters listening this time with open eyes and ears, and admiring their adventurous brother immensely. Even Mr. Jocelyn could not help becoming profoundly interested, but he took care not to show any pride he might feel in his son's achievements. When his father returned to his office, Rob went to his own bedchamber and sat for a long time by the window in deep thought. When at last he aroused himself, he found it was nearly 4 o'clock. "The Demon will be here presently," he said with a thrill of aversion, "and I must be in the workshop to receive him." Silently he stole to the foot of the attic stairs and then paused to listen. The house seemed very quiet, but he could hear his mother's voice softly humming a cradle song that she had sung to him when he was a baby. He had been nervous and unsettled and a little fearful until then, but perhaps the sound of his mother's voice gave him courage, for he boldly ascended the stairs and entered the workshop, closing and locking the door behind him. End of chapter 19. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 20. The Unhappy Fate of the Demon. Again the atmosphere quickened and pulsed with accumulating vibrations. Again the boy found himself aroused to eager expectancy. There was a whirl in the air, a crackling like distant musketry, a flash of dazzling light, and the Demon stood before him for the third time. "I give you greetings," said he, in a voice not unkindly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Demon," answered the boy, bowing gravely. "I see you have returned safely from your trip," continued the apparition cheerfully, "although at one time I thought you would be unable to escape. Indeed, unless I had knocked that tube from the rascally Turk's hand as he clambered to the top of the wall, I believe you would have been at the Yarkand oasis yet, either dead or alive, as chance might determine." "Were you there?" asked Rob. "To be sure. And I recovered the tube for you, without which you would have been helpless. But that is the only time I saw fit to interfere in any way." "I'm afraid I did not get a chance to give many hints to inventors or scientists," said Rob. "True, and I have deeply regretted it," replied the Demon. "But your unusual powers caused more astonishment and consternation than you perhaps imagined, for many saw you whom you were too busy to notice. As a result, several able electricians are now thinking new thoughts along new lines, and some of them may soon give these or similar inventions to the world." "You are satisfied, then?" asked Rob. "As to that," returned the Demon, composedly, "I am not. But I have hopes that with the addition of the 3 marvelous devices I shall present you with today, you will succeed in arousing so much popular interest in electrical inventions as to render me wholly satisfied with the result of this experiment." Rob regarded the brilliant apparition with a solemn face, but made no answer. "No living person," continued the Demon, "has ever before been favored with such comforting devices for the preservation and extension of human life as yourself. You seem quite unappreciative, it is true, but since our connection I have come to realize that you are but an ordinary boy, with many boyish limitations, so I do not condemn your foolish actions too harshly." "That is kind of you," said Rob. "To prove my friendliness," pursued the Demon, "I have brought, as the first of today's offerings, this electromagnetic restorer. You see it is shaped like a thin metal band, and is to be worn upon the brow, clasping at the back of the head. Its virtues surpass those of either the fabulous Fountain of Youth or the Elixir of Life, so vainly sought for in past ages, for its wearer will instantly become free from any bodily disease or pain and will enjoy perfect health and vigor. In truth, so great are its powers that even the dead may be restored to life, providing the blood has not yet chilled. In presenting you with this appliance, I feel I am bestowing upon you the greatest blessing and most longed for boon ever bequeathed to suffering humanity." Here he held the slender, dull-colored metallic band toward the boy. "Keep it," said Rob. The Demon started and gave him an odd look. "What did you say?" he asked. "I told you to keep it," answered Rob. "I don't want it." The Demon staggered back as if he had been struck. "Don't want it!" he gasped. "No, I've had enough of your infernal inventions!" cried the boy with sudden anger. He unclasped the traveling machine from his wrist and laid it on the table beside the Demon. "There's the thing that's responsible for most of my troubles," said he, bitterly. "What right has one person to fly through the air while all his fellow creatures crawl over the earth's surface? And why should I be cut off from all the rest of the world because you have given me this confounded traveling machine? I didn't ask for it, and I won't keep it a moment longer. Give it to someone you hate more than you do me." The Demon stared aghast and turned his glittering eyes wonderingly from Rob to the traveling machine and back again, as if to be sure he had heard and seen aright. "And here are your food tablets," continued the boy, placing the box upon the table. "I've only enjoyed one square meal since you gave them to me. They're all right to preserve life, of course, and answer the purpose for which they were made, but I don't believe Nature ever intended us to exist upon such things, or we wouldn't have the sense of taste which enables us to enjoy natural food. As long as I'm a human being, I'm going to eat like a human being, so I've consumed my last electrical concentrated food tablet, and don't you forget it." The Demon sank into a chair, nerveless and limp, but still staring fearfully at the boy. "And there's another of your unnatural devices," said Rob, putting the automatic record of events upon the table beside the other things. "What right have you to capture vibrations that radiate from private and secret actions and discover them to others who have no business to know them? This would be a fine world if everybody could peep into everyone else's affairs, wouldn't it? And here is your character marker. Nice thing for a decent person to own, isn't it? Anyone would take advantage of such a sneaking invention as that would be worse than a thief. Oh, I've used them, of course, and I ought to be spanked for having been so mean and underhanded, but I'll never be guilty of looking through them again." The Demon's face was frowning and indignant. He made a motion to rise, but thought better of it and sank back in his chair. "As for the Garment of Protection," resumed the boy after a pause, "I've worn it for the last time, and here it is at your service. I'll put the electric tube with it. Not that these are such very bad things in themselves, but I'll have none of your magical contrivances. I'll say this, however: if all armies were equipped with electrical tubes instead of guns and swords, the world would be spared a lot of misery and unnecessary bloodshed. Perhaps they will be in time, but that time hasn't arrived yet." "You might have hastened it," said the Demon sternly, "if you had been wise enough to use your powers properly." "That's just it," answered Rob. "I'm not wise enough. Nor is the majority of mankind wise enough to use such inventions as yours unselfishly and for the good of the world. If people were better and everyone had an equal show, it would be different." For some moments the Demon sat quietly thinking. Finally the frown left his face and he said with animation: "I have other inventions which you may use without any qualms of conscience. The electromagnetic restorer I offered you would be a great boon to your race and could not possibly do harm. And besides this, I have brought you what I call the Illimitable Communicator. It is a simple electric device which will enable you, wherever you may be, to converse with people in any part of the world without the use of such crude connections as wires. In fact, you may—" "Stop!" cried Rob. It is useless for you to describe it, because I'll have nothing more to do with you or your inventions. I have given them a fair trial, and they've got me into all sorts of trouble and made all my friends miserable. If I was some high-up scientist, it would be different. But I'm just a common boy, and I don't want to be anything else." "But your duty—" began the Demon. "My duty I owe to myself and to my family," interrupted Rob. "I have never cultivated science more than to fool with some simple electrical experiments, so I owe nothing to either science or the Demon of Electricity, so far as I can see." "But consider," remonstrated the Demon, rising to his feet and speaking in a pleading voice. "Consider the years that must elapse before anyone else is likely to strike the Master Key. And in the meanwhile, consider my helpless position, cut off from all interest in the world, while I have such wonderful inventions on my hands for the benefit of mankind. If you have no love for science or for the advancement of civilization, do have some consideration for your fellow creatures and for me." "If my fellow creatures would have as much trouble with your electrical inventions as I had, I am doing them a service by depriving them of your devices," said the boy. "As for yourself, I've no fault to find with you personally. You're a very decent sort of demon, and I've no doubt you mean well. But there's something wrong about our present combination, I'm sure. It isn't natural." The Demon made a gesture of despair. "Why, oh, why did not some intelligent person strike the Master Key?" he moaned. "That's it!" exclaimed Rob. "I believe that's the root of the whole evil." "What is?" inquired the Demon, stupidly. "The fact that an intelligent person did not strike the Master Key. You don't seem to understand. Well, I'll explain. You're the Demon of Electricity, aren't you?" "I am," said the other, drawing himself up proudly. "Your mission is to obey the commands of whoever is able to strike the Master Key of Electricity." "That is true." "I once read in a book that all things are regulated by exact laws of nature. If that is so, you probably owe your existence to those laws." The Demon nodded. "Doubtless it was intended that when mankind became intelligent enough and advanced enough to strike the Master Key, you and all your devices would not only be necessary and acceptable to them, but the world would be prepared for their general use. That seems reasonable, doesn't it?" "Perhaps so. Yes, it seems reasonable," answered the Demon, thoughtfully. "Accidents are always liable to happen," continued the boy. "By accident the Master Key was struck long before the world of science was ready for it, or for you. Instead of considering it an accident and paying no attention to it, you immediately appeared to me, a mere boy, and offered your services." "I was very anxious to do something," returned the Demon, evasively. "You've no idea how stupid it is for me to live invisible and unknown, while all the time I have in my possession secrets of untold benefit to the world." "Well, you'll have to keep cool and bide your time," said Rob. "The world wasn't made in a minute, and while civilization is going on at a pretty good pace, we're not up to the Demon of Electricity yet." "What shall I do?" groaned the apparition, wringing his hands miserably. "Oh, what shall I do?" "Go home and lie down," replied Rob, sympathetically. "Take it easy and don't get rattled. Nothing was ever created without a use, they say, so your turn will come some day, sure. I'm sorry for you, old fellow, but it's all your own fault." "You are right!" exclaimed the Demon, striding up and down the room and causing thereby such a crackling of electricity in the air that Rob's hair became rigid enough to stand on end. "You are right, and I must wait patiently and silently until my bonds are loosed by intelligence rather than chance. It is a dreary fate, but I must wait, I must wait, I must wait." "I'm glad you've come to your senses," remarked Rob, dryly. "So if you've nothing more to say—" "No, I have nothing more to say. There is nothing more to say. You and I are two. We should never have met," retorted the Demon, showing great excitement. "Oh, I didn't seek your acquaintance," said Rob, "but I've tried to treat you decently, and I've no fault to find with you except that you forgot you were a slave and tried to be master." The Demon did not reply. He was busily forcing the various electrical devices that Rob had relinquished into the pockets of his fiery jacket. Finally he turned with an abrupt movement. "Good-bye!" he cried. "When mortal eyes next behold me, they will be those of one fit to command my services. As for you, your days will be passed in obscurity, and your name be unknown to fame. Good-bye, forever!" The room filled with a flash of white light, so like a sheet of lightning that the boy went reeling backwards, half stunned and blinded by its dazzling intensity. When he recovered himself, the Demon of Electricity had disappeared. Rob's heart was very light as he left the workshop and made his way down the attic stairs. "Some people might think I was a fool to give up those electrical inventions," he reflected. "But I'm one of those persons who know when they've had enough. It strikes me the fool is the fellow who can't learn a lesson. I've learned mine all right. It's no fun being a century ahead of the times." End of Chapter 20. End of The Master Key. Recorded by Judy Bieber, 2006.